The silent takedown, Ivory Coast's most feared figure falls. Welcome to History Rewrites. Please, if you're new here, subscribe to our channel. Let's dive in. The untouchable has fallen. In a shocking turn of events, Ivory Coast's most powerful figure has been silenced in a mysterious and secretive manner. From the corridors of power to the shadows of obscurity, we'll take you through the untold story of how this giant fell. What led to this dramatic downfall? What secrets were uncovered? And what does this mean for the future of Ivory Coast? Please subscribe to our channel, stay tuned for the full story, and get ready for the most shocking revelations.
There are moments when a leader falls, and the people remember only the silence he demanded, not the words he spoke. The images from Abidjan are still etched into the world's memory. Military vehicles parked outside the presidential palace, soldiers standing at attention, not for power, but for the people. A single statement broadcast across the country. The era of Alassane Ouattara is over. This republic belongs to Ivorians again. For years, Ouattara had been presented to the world as a stabilizing force in West Africa. Western-educated IMF endorsed pro-France, pro-liberalization, pro-growth, but to the millions of Ivorians who lived under his rule, he became something else entirely, a dictator dressed as a democrat. Now, in the aftermath of the military takeover, something extraordinary has emerged, something more absolute than the coup itself, an entire nation refusing to speak kindly of its former leader. No murals, no legacy defenders, no counter-protests in support. From teachers to taxi drivers, farmers to journalists, there is one unspoken agreement echoing from Abobo to Grand Bassam. Don't talk to us about what he did right, we lived what he did wrong. When memory is weaponized by those who suffer, there is no redemption narrative. There is only truth and consequences. This isn't a political rejection, it's a national cleansing, and the man at the center of it, once the darling of foreign investors, is now a symbol of everything Ivory Coast is determined never to become again. Not all dictators wear uniforms. Some wear suits and smile for summit cameras. Alassane Ouattara's rise was polished, professional, and meticulously engineered. Educated in the U.S., trained by the IMF, touted as an economic savior for post-conflict Ivory Coast. He spoke the language of reform, used the vocabulary of development, and walked the red carpets of Paris, Brussels, and Washington with ease. To the West, he was the model African leader, predictable, manageable, and friendly to multinational interests. But back home, in the neighborhoods of Abidjan and the villages of Yamoussoukro, the reality was far uglier. Jobs were promised, then privatized infrastructure projects ballooned budgets, then quietly collapsed. Political opponents were jailed under legal technicalities. Journalists vanished. The CFA franc remained untouched, France's monetary grip as tight as ever. He ruled not through fear, but through sophisticated suffocation, where criticism was labeled treason, where dissent was treated as terrorism, and where foreign diplomats turned a blind eye as long as contracts were honored. And for years, Ivorians were told to be grateful. But gratitude eroded fast when inflation soared, food prices doubled, and corruption danced freely in government corridors. In 2020, when Ouattara declared his intention to run for a third term, despite constitutional term limits, the mask finally slipped. Protests erupted. Dozens were killed. Election observers said little. He won again. But the people remembered, and when the military finally stepped in, it wasn't with violence. It was with vindication. The reaction was not fear, it was relief. Enfin, one woman whispered at a protest. La honte s'en va. Finally, the shame leaves us. The illusion had shattered, and no one, not even his defenders, was willing to tape it back together. When power leaves a man, so does the illusion that he mattered more than the people he silenced. In the days following the military takeover, a strange phenomenon unfolded across Ivory Coast. Statues of Ouattara quietly removed, billboards taken down overnight, official portraits stripped from public offices, not by force, but by disgust. There was no mourning, no calls for respect, no speeches asking for patience. Not one neighborhood rose to defend his legacy. And that silence wasn't apathy, it was judgment. Teachers in schools stopped including his name in civic lessons. Radio hosts refused to play clips from his past speeches. Young graffiti artists in Abidjan painted murals showing a locked treasure chest labeled Ivory Coast, with Ouattara's face as the key that never opened it. In working-class areas, old campaign posters were burned, not as protest, but as a ritual of erasure. And when a foreign journalist asked an elder in Bouaké if there was anything positive to remember about Ouattara, he answered coldly, "Yes, that he's gone." What stunned outside observers was the unanimity of the rejection. Even those who had once worked under him began confessing. One former economic advisor admitted on live radio, "We thought we were building a state, but we were maintaining a monopoly of misery hidden behind statistics." The IMF, World Bank, and French diplomatic corps offered no formal defense. They knew. They had seen the contracts, the suppression, the fake consultations. But Ouattara had served his purpose, and now that he had outlived it, he was no longer useful. The people understood this too. They weren't just rejecting him. They were rejecting everything he represented. Some leaders fall, others vanish beneath the weight of a silence so total, it erases even the myth of what they once were. In the shadows of obedience, some soldiers were quietly taking notes, not on orders, but on injustices. The fall of Ouattara didn't begin with a mutiny. It began with memory. For years, young officers across Ivory Coast's armed forces watched their families suffer. While their salaries stagnated, their barracks decayed, and their commanders thrived. They saw military equipment arrive from foreign partners, yet rarely in full, and always late. They noticed contracts with foreign companies that secured mining regions, but never secured drinking water for the villages nearby. They asked, "If we're protecting the people, why are we guarding elites?" One of them, Colonel Ibrahim Sori, posted anonymously in a secure forum. "They call him a president, but he governs like an ambassador of outside interests. Whose uniform are we wearing?" That post was shared among junior officers across 5 bases. It wasn't rebellion, it was awakening. Meanwhile, General Sekou Doumbia, who had long kept a low profile, began quietly building trust among non-aligned battalions. He didn't preach nationalism, he didn't rally with speeches. He simply asked one question: if not us, who will protect Ivory Coast from becoming a well-dressed prison? When the time came to move, the soldiers didn't hesitate. There were no shootouts, no looting, no midnight purges. Ouattara was placed under house arrest. His guards stepped aside. The presidential compound was secured not with celebration, but with solemn understanding. The generals issued a single statement: there will be no transition to another strongman, only to the people. They called for calm, they banned vengeance, they opened the airwaves, and to the shock of the world, the country obeyed. Ivory Coast did not collapse, it recalibrated. Not because it was forced, but because someone in uniform remembered the duty was to the people, not to power. When history turns, the loudest voice comes not from embassies, but from alleys, markets, and classrooms. In the hours after Ouattara's removal, foreign embassies scrambled. France issued a cold, cautious line: "We hope for stability and constitutional order." The U.S. State Department followed: "We are monitoring the situation closely." ECOWAS, as usual, called for dialogue. But on the streets of Abidjan, the dialogue had already begun, without them. At market stalls, women shook their heads and muttered, "Il a vendu ce pays." He sold this country. University students turned lecture halls into open forums on sovereignty, betrayal, and the cost of borrowed development. Truck drivers wrote phrases on their windshields: "Pas un mot pour Ouattara," not a word for Ouattara. "Dictateur propre, pay sale." Clean dictator, dirty country. One vendor near Yopougon, when interviewed by an Al Jazeera reporter, said, "They called him a reformer. We called him a reformatted colonizer." This wasn't bitterness, it was testimony, raw, unapologetic, and united. Even those who had once benefited from the regime, the contractors, the bureaucrats, the diplomats, remained silent. Because to defend Ouattara was now to confess complicity, and no one wanted to do that. Social media exploded with the hashtag Rien de bon sur lui, nothing good about him. It trended not only in Côte d'Ivoire, but across Francophone Africa. From Dakar to Douala, from Libreville to Bamako, Ivory Coast's rejection became a regional mirror. When an entire people deny a legacy, the world must listen, not to the words of politicians, but to the silence of former allies, now hiding in shame. One dictatorship's end can be another nation's beginning. As the dust settled in Abidjan, the continent took notice. In Mali, crowds gathered outside the French embassy, waving signs that read, "Ivory Coast has spoken, we speak next." In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré delivered a rare televised address. Ivory Coast's military did not bring war, it brought clarity. And clarity is the first step to freedom. In Cameroon, youth-led podcasts began dissecting Ouattara's fall, not as an isolated incident, but as part of a broader rejection of post-independence puppetry. Meanwhile, French media outlets scrambled to control the narrative. Coup raises concern for regional security. Loss of a longtime partner. Threat to democracy? But these headlines no longer landed in Africa, because in the minds of many Africans, Ouattara did not represent democracy. He represented dependency managed with eloquence. What shocked Western strategists most was not that he fell, but that not one person in his own country demanded he return, not one protest in his favor, not one campaign to restore him, not one legacy institution stepping in to defend his record. Diplomats quietly updated their reports. Civilian sentiment overwhelmingly hostile to former president. No pro-Ouattara organizing detected. Population sentiment favors complete detachment from prior regime. The message was loud. Ouattara's fall wasn't controversial. It was cleansing. And with each passing day, Ivory Coast showed the world what post-dictator healing looked like. Open debates, regional consultations, calls for a constitution not authored in French embassies, but in local dialects. Africa is not destabilizing. It is restabilizing, on its own terms, with its own tools, and without permission from those who once claimed ownership of its future. When a regime falls, it doesn't just leave ruins, it leaves receipts. One of the military's first acts after assuming control was to unlock the archives, and what the public found inside shattered any remaining illusions. Leaked contracts showed that under Ouattara, over 70% of national mining revenues were routed through companies headquartered in Europe, the UAE, and offshore jurisdictions. Telecom and energy sectors were leased at rates far below regional standards. Public universities received less than 1% of the budget allocated to presidential travel and military parade logistics. One document revealed that a $250 million youth employment grant from a major Western institution had been untraceable for 6 years. The file was signed by a cabinet member, still living in exile. Another set of memos showed how opposition journalists were monitored through state-purchased European spyware, intended on paper for cybersecurity research. But it wasn't just the numbers. Testimonies from former government workers, now whistleblowers, began emerging on national radio. One former ministry official admitted, "The only thing worse than what we allowed was that we smiled while doing it." The military government didn't have to prosecute. The people were prosecuting history in their own way. High school students held forums titled, "What We Were Never Taught About Our Leaders." Musicians released protest songs sampling Ouattara's speeches, juxtaposed with footage of food lines and police violence. One song went viral with the hook, "Il a parlé pour eux, il n'a jamais parlé pour nous." He spoke for them. He never spoke for us. Dictators often try to erase their mistakes, but in Ivory Coast, the people turned those mistakes into a monument of resistance, a museum of warnings. No statue of Ouattara would be built, but the archives would remain open, and they would teach future generations one lesson: never mistake respectability for righteousness. When the old empire loses its tongue, the people find their voice. After Ouattara's removal and the flood of revelations that followed, a linguistic revolution took root across Ivory Coast. Words once used to soften reality were rejected outright. Economic partnership became foreign extraction contract. Stability became managed compliance. Reform became rebranding of exploitation. And most importantly, president became a term that would be redefined before ever being used again. In marketplaces, schools, and radio stations, Ivorian citizens no longer asked, "Who will lead us?" They asked, "How will we lead ourselves?" This shift wasn't cosmetic. It was cultural armor against future manipulation. Even the provisional government adopted a new lexicon, no longer referring to itself as an authority, but as a stewardship, publicly addressing citizens as shareholders in the republic, swearing in local administrators with a new oath to defend the dignity of the people above the comfort of elites. The national media, newly freed from government control, began producing people's history segments, highlighting not political figures, but activists, midwives, farmers, and soldiers who had defied unjust orders during the Ouattara years. A cultural renaissance was underway. Poets revived suppressed dialects, dancers choreographed stories of corruption and justice, filmmakers created documentaries titled "We Were Ruled But Not Represented." And across Francophone Africa, these voices traveled fast. Young people in Senegal, Benin, and Guinea began using Ivorian slogans like "Rien de bon sur lui," nothing good about him, République du vrai, Republic of Truth. Ivory Coast wasn't exporting propaganda, it was exporting awakening. When tyranny ends, silence is not the cure. Storytelling is. And in Ivory Coast, storytelling became the loudest form of justice. The world called it a coup. Ivory Coast called it a beginning. With Ouattara gone and his legacy dismantled, Ivory Coast turned not to rebuilding the past, but to reinventing the future. And it started with something radical. The people wrote the new system themselves. Rather than draft another elite-controlled constitution, the transitional government opened an unprecedented platform called La Voix de la République, an online and offline civic writing process. Every citizen could submit proposals. Thousands did. From young street vendors to retired nurses, ideas poured in. Term limits reduced to one 5-year, non-renewable mandate. No public official allowed to hold dual nationality while in office. Mandatory national broadcast of public budgets. Monthly citizen review boards to monitor all future foreign investments. The proposal that drew the loudest cheers. All new treaties must be debated live on national television before being signed. This was not about transparency for optics. It was about reclaiming ownership of the republic. Meanwhile, former state-owned buildings were repurposed. Ouattara's presidential retreat was turned into a public high school. The former Ministry of Communications became a people's media training center. Abandoned police barracks were converted into free medical clinics. Young architects redesigned government offices to be open auditorium structures, glass-walled, accessible, and monitored. The nation wasn't building walls, it was building mirrors. Other countries took notice. Guinea requested access to Ivory Coast's civic reassembly documentation. Burkina Faso sent educators to study its new school curriculums. Togo's opposition parties adopted La Voix de la République as a model for constitutional reform. It began as a military correction. It became a civic revolution. And soon it evolved into something few African states had ever seen, a participatory republic born from refusal, not permission. Some names fade, others are buried, but some are erased by the will of an entire nation. 1 year after the fall of Alassane Ouattara, Ivory Coast stood taller, not because it was richer, but because it was finally its own. There were no monuments to the former president, no public roads named after him, no official Remembrance Day. Even schoolbooks, newly published under the Ministry of Civic Education, spoke of the 2010-2023 period with brutal clarity, a time of managed dependency, a government aligned with external interests, a leadership that dressed foreign control in domestic colors. When a foreign correspondent asked a market trader if she missed the stability of the Ouattara era, her laughter cut sharper than any revolution. He was stable. We were starving. The military council, now fully dissolved, was praised not for seizing power, but for refusing to keep it. General Sékou Doumbia returned to civilian life and never gave a final interview. His only recorded post-retirement statement read, "We do not need medals, we need memory, and we remember who we are now." Ivory Coast held its first free, publicly financed elections. The candidates were educators, trade unionists, young civil engineers, and artists. No one campaigned in luxury cars. No campaign posters were printed outside the country. The new president, a former professor, no foreign ties, no offshore accounts, no second passport. When he took the oath of office, he did not swear to protect the republic. He swore to obey the people. The crowd chanted not a party slogan, but a promise. Plus jamais Louis, plus jamais ça. Never him, never again. Ivory Coast didn't just remove a dictator, it removed the possibility of another one. It did not beg for freedom, it declared it. And in doing so, it reminded Africa and the world that dignity, once awakened, cannot be governed. It must be honored. Over a soft, rising Ivorian drumbeat, one final phrase appears. Not one word in his defense, not one voice in his favor. He ruled with silence and was buried by it.